Are you ready to take a ride on the ladder of love? When JD Vance invoked St. Augustine's concept of the ordo amoris, he wasn't just quoting obscure Catholic theology. He was opening the doors to a new era in the culture wars, one in which we could finally see the roots of all that cultural difference, not merely its strange fruit. The ordo amoris, sometimes called the ladder of love, is an injunction to love first family, then community, then society, then nation, then humanity. It's an acknowledgement that loving everything and everyone equally is not only exhausting, it's flat out wrong. Yet this is precisely what the liberal world order has asked of us. Universalism, infinite empathy, a flattening of rules, the bulldozing of subtle gradations and natural hierarchies. In the context in which JD Vance spoke, it's the liberal injunction to treat the illegal migrant exactly the same as the generations deep citizen. Here in Hungary, the government isn't shy about putting the Christian foundations of its policies on show. Prime Minister Orbán often ends his speeches with, "Hungary before all else, God above us all." He's famous for slapping down EU ministers by saying that Hungarians view the family as the true building block of society, not the individual. From Vance to Orbán to the wider world, the dividing lines are shaping up. After decades of liberal dominance, finally, the right doesn't seem to be just the left driving at the speed limit. Not only is philosophy back in politics, theology might even be too. The culture wars and the politics of love, this time on View from the Danube. Hello, I'm Rod Dreher, and welcome to View from the Danube. As hard as it is to believe, our last presentation was the day before the presidential inauguration. It seems like 100 years has passed since that day in January. We're going to talk about today all of the things that have happened in Washington and around the world since Donald Trump returned to the White House. Today I'm joined by John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute, Liliana Smith, Director General for International Affairs at the Ludovica University of Public Service here in Budapest, and Callum Nicholson, the Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. Well, friends, we have a lot to talk about. Trump has come in and he has launched this revolution. You might even call it a new world order. You know, he's instituting tariffs. He's regained control of the U.S. border. He's talked about taking Greenland and the Panama Canal. He has spectacularly upended the U.S. Agency for International Development, which seems to have been the fount of funding all the NGOs around the world to spread globalist liberalism, and on and on and on. What do we think about this? I mean, John, you and I were talking before the broadcast today about 50 years ago, we celebrated Margaret Thatcher's defeat of Ted Heath. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the parallels to what Trump is doing in Washington might be?
Well, 50 years ago, Mrs. Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. She didn't become prime minister for another 4 years. They were full of conflict within the party, in which she gradually gained ground. Then she became prime minister. It took some years beyond that for her to establish dominance in the cabinet. And when she defeated the miners, she won the Falklands War, the economy started to recover. Then, in a sense, she at that point was the dominant figure in British politics for the next 8 or 9 years, until she fell from power dramatically. Now, that is so this was the beginning, and it was important, not just because it was the beginning. It was important because it meant that there was a fairly new and decisive kind of conservatism. The word decisive is important, but when she came in, they introduced right away some very dramatic policy changes. For example, they simply abolished exchange control, which was a very big change for the British economy, made it very open indeed. It's exactly the same, I think, with Trump. Even people who don't like Trump have a sense of relief that the government is able to act decisively, that it's not permanently deadlocked and held back by the chains of the courts, international agencies, international and the rest. And I think that, so to speak, the smack of firm government, people generally like that, unless, of course, it's directed against them.
Right. Well, I noticed at the Super Bowl, when the performer was doing the national anthem, the camera focused briefly on President Trump standing there making the salute. He had his eyes closed. The crowd went wild cheering for him. So, and he's got, like, Callum, you were telling me, a 53% approval rating.
Yeah, that's what I saw today.
That's never
highest
been
he's ever had. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Democratic Party, by contrast, there was a poll that came out a few days ago showing that they are at the lowest rating of either party since polling on that question was started. I mean, they're as low as you can get. Where is this all going, Liliana? What strikes you as a European seeing all this happen on the other side of the pond?
Mm-hmm. There's this quite a famous saying that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where a decade happens. Well, this is a saying by Lenin, so maybe it's not the best to be repeating it right now, but I believe that's what's exactly happening right now in the United States. President Trump is some kind of a president of the revolution. I would say he's the president of the people. And this is why the support that is so high, and as you mentioned, it will be probably growing tremendously in the next week. So he's doing exactly what the people are expecting him to do. He's very honest. I believe that's probably one of the most honest presidents.
Honest? Donald Trump? Really?
I mean, what I mean? Well, what he says, he's doing. With this regards, and of course, with regards to his stand to the American interest, he's very much focused on the business transactions. But is it so wrong? At least we know what we can expect and what other countries can expect. I don't like this hypocrisy that is so present, and I believe he's the contrary to it. So he's very much honest with his statements and with his actions. Mm-hmm. Well, we will see what we can expect from it in Europe, but I wouldn't be scared because there are a lot of sayings and statements that, we should be scared. I don't think so. If we're talking about business negotiations, if you're going to the table, you cannot be scared. I think you should be prepared and know your business partner.
We're going to get back to Trump in Europe in a second, but Callum, the one thing that strikes me in this month or so that Trump has been in the White House is that he's been able to get away with all this radical reshuffling of the U.S. government without much effective opposition at all from the Democrats and without much pushback from the public. That signals to me that the establishment itself was so rotten, if it can be pushed over so easily. What do you think?
Well, actually, I mean, it's interesting you talked about Trump and whether he's truthful or not. And, the fact-checking websites used to say Trump lies as he speaks. But I've always felt with Trump that whereas if you look at someone like Obama as a contrast, Obama, I don't think was factually a liar, but there were deeper lies in his frame of reference. Whereas with Trump, I think what he particularly says isn't necessarily always truthful, but there are deeper truths, I think, in much like the Joker in the court can observe patterns which perhaps other people can't. And I think the reason that he's been so popular is that sometimes what he's saying in the spirit of it, if not the letter, resonates with people as true. And I think what we're seeing is a rejection of the sort of ossified culture that's emerged in not just the last 10 years of all this social justice, but perhaps since the end of the Cold War and the neoliberal era, or perhaps going back to the post-war period and all the institutions we built. The culture feels pretty tired. I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel the culture we've been living in felt very tired. When we've been talking about a vibe shift, for me, it really reflects the fact that everyone felt a sense of a release of tension, a release from the vice grip of this suffocating
wokeness and
but not even necessarily the more politically charged categories. It's even just the the very fact that all of the ways you can live your life were given as boxes. By analogy, you remember when Facebook started, you could go in there and you had little categories by which you identify yourself. So here are my favorite films, my favorite books, and then your pronouns and so on. It gives you a set number of things to choose from in like an Excel spreadsheet. A culture like that, where all of the options of what you can be are given, is stultifying. And if you go back to the pre-digital age, if you just go back a few decades, I don't think there was much more room to do something weird. And you see this in art, by the way. Novels used to be, really creative. Now they're very formulaic.
Well, if you look at the Super Bowl commercials, that's perhaps one of the most interesting things about the whole Super Bowl as a cultural event. The commercials are often treated as art forms because the advertisers roll out their most interesting concepts. There was one that the National Football League, the NFL, rolled out that showed a young black woman taking on a team of white men and beating them all. This seemed like something from the distant past, from a century ago, didn't it? I mean, in just 6 weeks or so, the vibe has shifted so radically.
There's actually a great example of this, that movie that has the most Oscar nominations ever, Emilia Perez.
Yeah,
it feels like
13.
a movie from was it 13? It feels like a movie from a totally different era because it's starring it's about
a drug cartel leader in Mexico who wants to become a woman and does become a transgender woman.
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems to me this was just Hollywood trying to, tell Trump where to get off, but it's pathetic. And it turns out the star, had some pro-Hitler commentary online. It's such a debacle.
Can we look at this from a slightly different angle? I mean, we're talking about a burst of energy going, and it's definitely going onto the side of populism in the big row internationally between populism and liberal democracy, so to speak. I think Trump's an example of that. If you look back at Thatcher in 1975, Nigel Lawson, a year or two later, defined Thatcherism as including a dash of populism, and I think that is absolutely true. But Liliana, we've recently had a new government in Poland, and that too has been quite energetic, except in the opposite direction. It's a kind of injection, it seemed from me here. It looked like kind of an injection of establishment energy. How is that being taken? How is it succeeding?
Well, I would say there's lack of energy, first of all, because everything the new government promised during the campaign, they proposed the very famous 100 promises, and actually almost none of them were promised and were not done. So I would say there's actually lack of this energy, and the support for the government is also not as high as it used to be. So I don't know if it's actually the shift, the flow coming from United States. Who knows? I don't know. But as you mentioned, yeah, it's rather this establishment, very well known already in the Western world, energy.
This is the million-dollar question, I think, for Europe, because we can look across the pond at America now and see this incredible effervescence, political things are happening there, and yet in Europe, they seem to be frozen still. And I was just in the UK, and I mean, all of my conservative friends there, the young ones are planning to migrate, and those who are older they'll be doing well if they can avoid cutting their own throats. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. Do you foresee that the Trump effect will have any spillover effect in Britain and in continental Europe?
Well, surely. I mean, please remember that we're having soon a presidential election in Poland. And we will see into which direction it will go. But for now, I would say that actually the candidate who was supposed to not win, according to most of the polls that were rather connected to the current government, is actually his support is tremendously growing. It's Karol Nawrocki. It's an independent candidate, however, associated with the Law and Justice, so the previous government's candidate. And in the beginning, I would say people were not giving him much, but now he's becoming one of the most popular ones on the stage. So who knows? Maybe the spillover effect will come to Poland.
Hungary under Viktor Orban has long been a pariah in Brussels and in the European Union, and Viktor Orban really made it his business to build relations with Donald Trump before the campaign, and now it seems to be paying off. Do you think, Callum, that that's going to make a difference in Europe now that Orban and the populists like Giorgia Meloni, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, they seem to have an inside track with the new regime in Washington?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that ultimately the America First policy is very much about putting America first and its economic interests first, and the EU, at least economically, operates as a bloc. So there's kind of a challenge there in terms of, I think it's if there can be an organized set of voices in Europe who can speak on behalf of Europe to Trump that can influence policy, then perhaps that's got some utility. But I think it's a tricky balance to see how it'll play out, because I imagine economic policy is different from friends and allies in a political sense. And I see an emerging tension between these two things. How it's going to play out, I mean, I don't think we really know. Perhaps John has a thought.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that it's hard going for populists in London at the moment. First of all, they know, and people on the right in general, they know that this government is going to be in power for the next 4.5 years. There's no way it can be ousted. It has such a large majority. Secondly, until recently, Trump has not been popular in England. Yes, he has his supporters, most famously Nigel Farage. And the Reform Party, which is actually now level pegging in the polls with the Conservatives and with the Labour government, they're all getting about 23 to 25%. The Reform Party is obviously his support club in UK politics. And I do think that there's another factor which you've got to take into account. Trump likes Britain. He's made this clear again and again. And, you know, when someone likes you, you tend to like them back. And he's offering the Brits a favourable deal if they want to take it. And I think that although all of Keir Starmer's instincts are to move more towards Europe and away from America, this deal is probably sufficient to keep Britain in what I'd call the mid-Atlantic position in European politics. I couldn't say that with complete certainty, but I do think that for the next 2 years, we should look closely at how the government is moving, because I think the Tory party and Reform will eventually come together, and there'll be a formidable opponent then. Until that happens, the government is where the action is. But I think that government is bound to sort of not want to alienate Trump.
And later this month, we're looking at a new election in Germany. Thierry Breton, the former EU commissioner, warned on television very arrogantly. He said that, if we don't get the right result, we annul the election in Romania, and we'll do it in Germany too. And what he means, of course, is if the Alliance for Germany, the AfD, actually gets into the ruling position there. What do you expect from Germany, and how do you think that Europe will react?
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with Germany is that I believe President Trump does not have as much affection towards this country than, for example, towards Britain. So it will be, I believe, much more complicated, especially if we look at the trade deficit that is present with Germany. So I believe it will be very difficult. But the problem is that even if AfD, let's say, will win the elections, I doubt if they will be able to create a bigger ruling coalition. And it was the same in Poland. Even though the Law and Justice won the elections, they were not able to create a tangible coalition that would be able to rule the country. So it might be also the case in Germany. But if AfD will be able to actually get such a high result, it would surely change the whole situation in the country. But as we can see, looking at the polls, people are not satisfied with the current situation. And the statements also coming from Elon Musk, they are somehow being able to be understood very, very clearly.
What is Musk saying for...
Well, he's openly supporting AfD. He said vote for AfD, that's it. Yeah. So it's a very clear statement that people actually are somehow getting very, very clearly.
One interesting thing about that is the BBC had a story recently about asking why are so many young German men going to the so-called far right, the AfD? And the idea, the answer from the story seems to make sense to me. They don't see that they have a future for themselves in Germany. They don't see that the country is safe because of all the immigrant crime. They see that the typical masculine virtues are suppressed under this managerial liberalism. It's the same reason why so many young American men navigated to Trump or moved over to Trump. Do you all see the decline of a certain female sensibility that has become central to our politics? You know, the therapeutic, the compassionate, we must place the outsider high up, and masculinity is toxic. There's some talk now. Mary Harrington, our friend in the UK, she wrote a piece recently on her Substack saying that the era of heroic masculinity is upon us. And she even said, if you want a re-enchanted society, that is to say, a society that has a sense of purpose and meaning and forward movement, you need to first re-enchant the men. And the only way to do that is through valorizing what she calls heroic masculinity. What do you think about that? Does it make any sense?
Well, I do feel in the last few years there's been a bit of a war on sort of the morale of, I think, a lot of young men, actually. And if you engage it with race as well, if you look at the UK, for instance, there's one demographic that no one cares about, which is, poor working class white boys from places like Whitehaven or Workington, the area that...
And working girls too, white working class girls too.
Yeah, and white girls too. But basically so if in the order of ranking though, in the whole setup, if you're a white working class boy in a provincial part of the north of England, no one really cares about you. And no one's really interested in your prospects, your social mobility, and so on. So there's definitely a problem there, and there's been a bit of a proactive. It's one thing to say there should be equal opportunities and so on. Personally, I have no issue with that, but I do think there's been a strange sort of people talk about toxic masculinity, but there's been quite a toxic treatment of, I think, a lot of young men in the culture, being told that you're presumed to be innocent, guilty until proven innocent. You're presumed to be, harassing someone or something, and until proven innocent. I don't think it's been healthy.
Don't you think that one of the biggest problems we're facing at the moment, and which causes so many other problems, is the terribly bad relations between men and women in our society? I mean, in all our societies. Now, I am amazed about this because when I look back to my 20s and 30s, the idea that men and women didn't want to go out with each other, didn't want to date, would virtually give a potential date a questionnaire as to whether they were they had the suitable political views to date. That just would have seemed completely absurd. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for it. I don't think I like the new dating world for people. I think it's, the Tinder and all of those things. They turn what would have previously been a meeting of people to a meeting of bodies, and that's not satisfactory. And I think men and women have got to start liking each other more. And I think what's happening here is there is a rebellion among men to say we don't want to be treated as either complete neuters or as sexual criminals. We want to be men like our grandfathers, I suppose, and that I think will ultimately, not right away, be quite powerful for women as well, because women, after all, do look to men to give them some sort of protection, which they badly need in our societies now, which are becoming much more dangerous from the standpoint of rape, and much more dangerous from the standpoint of being afraid to go out at night. That's not happening here, is it?
In Hungary,
Here in Hungary. My wife and her girlfriends, they have a meal out and they walk back through the parks and everything. They never feel nervous or afraid, and nothing ever happens. So I think we have an answer here. How do we get back to it everywhere else?
I say, I've been living in Budapest 4 years, and I actually asked a female friend of mine recently. I said, because she always walks home at night at like 11:30 at night, and I said, "Are you finding this?" She said, "Yeah, it's just not a problem here." And I don't know any female friends here in the center of the city who have this problem. One other thing I just wanted to say: do you remember the Me Too movement? It's now 8 years ago, I suppose, 2017. The effect of that movement, I felt, was somewhat perverse, because actually, it didn't actually. The men who changed their behavior were not the men who were the problem. It was the decent people who then reflected and thought, oh, I better be more careful. And but whereas the guys who actually are abusive will have continued to be abusive. They're not taking any lessons from that movement. And so I think there's been, some of these movements, perhaps well-intentioned, have had some perverse outcomes that impact, I think, men in the way you've suggested.
Now, I noticed Liliana, when the whole subject came up, we got a real rise out of her. What's your take on this?
Well, what John mentioned, I totally agree with you. But I would also add to it that we are experiencing some kind of a crisis of loneliness right now, because people actually don't go out. If you look at the younger generation, then they don't go out. They actually don't meet people. They don't want to meet people. They can handle their whole life with their smartphone, everything. Starting from the Tinder and actually not need to go out and talk to the people. The fact that they don't need to even talk to the driver. When they, for example, order the taxi, you can even choose an option, please don't talk to me, I don't wanna be bothered. You don't need to go to a shop anymore because they can bring everything to your home. Like, we are, instead of going out and actually, especially after the pandemic, when everyone was isolated, people are isolating themselves again. And that's, I believe, another problem, why men and women cannot meet each other and they just don't like each other, because they live with some kind of expectations that are completely out of the reality.
Yeah, and this is not a problem that can be solved through politics, and so I don't know how we solve it, but it is very much an issue. Every young woman I know in Budapest and every young woman I know back in the US who is of marriage age, ready to start a family, they complain they can't find good men. And I don't know as many young men, but they all complain too that they can't seem to find anybody. And something's wrong here. Somebody needs to crack this nut and figure out how to change things. Well, we've been talking about love, and that's a nice segue into our second segment about disordered love. In the introduction, I talked about JD Vance bringing up the concept of ordo amoris, ordered of love. And this came up in a debate over immigration policy. JD Vance is a Catholic convert. In fact, I was there when he was received into the Catholic Church. He invited me to come up for that. And he was catechized by Dominicans, so he knows his catechism. He was criticized in the U.S. for being hard-hearted towards immigrants because the Catholic bishops in the U.S. are famously soft-hearted on migration, as is Pope Francis. Rory Stewart, the British politician, jumped into the debate and said that JD is being a bad Christian, and Rory quoted John, from the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 15. I have it written down here. Jesus said this, "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And JD Vance, we'll get into the details here, but he said, no, there's a certain thing called the order of love, how we should love people, to whom are our first obligations. Before we get into that, though, Callum, who is Rory Stewart, and why is he such a perfect cipher for this debate?
Well, Rory Stewart is a Brit who had a very interesting background. He started off as he was a tutor to Prince Charles's sons, and then he went to Oxford and entered the diplomatic service, and then wrote a couple of great books. He's a brilliant writer. He's one of the best writers, I think, of his generation in the UK. And he wrote his whole view politically was very much interested in the particular, not the general, which makes it all the more surprising, the view he's taken now, because he's shifted now in the last 10 years. If you look at Rory Stewart's work, he used to say we need to understand cultures in their particularity, have no one-size-fits-all answer. But now he's adopting this view that the one-size-fits-all answer is precisely the answer we should have. I think in this case, the difference is that the truth is, the reality as it is that we do love the people we know more than absolute strangers, which is self-evident. I don't think anyone needs to, it's complete common sense. But I think what Stewart is arguing for is not what is the case, but what we think ought to be the case. And I think, therefore, he's somewhat missing Vance's point on that.
Yeah, well, as I said in the introduction to our podcast today, JD Vance believes that our first duties are to our families, and then to our neighbors, our communities, our nation, and then to humanity. And there's nothing unchristian about that at all. And of course, liberals often like to believe that, no, we have an equal obligation to everybody, but no liberal would choose to save a stranger's child over his own. That's just not human nature.
Hope, at least.
But there are liberals who will choose to send their children to a bad state school rather than to send them to a private school where they get a better education, because they want to demonstrate their absolute fidelity to equality as an ideal. And in fact, if you look at what political parties in the West want, on the left, it's quite clear, they are really caught between the fact that they want to please their constituents, but they really want to establish substantive equality between the people in their own country and the people in the third world and other countries and other continents. And that effectively means at the back of their mind, they're always prepared to favor redistribution from the taxpayers to foreign aid in various ways, which, as we've seen recently, has become extremely corrupt in the case of USAID. So I think we've got to bear that in mind. I have one other point. The other point is very simple. If you look at Christ's words, the occasions when he seems to be saying that you must follow me if you're conflicting with your family, then you must follow me and abandon them. He's talking very clearly about a choice between him, the Son of the living God, and other people. That's a choice which, unless you're very odd, you are obliged, I think, to make for Christ. There aren't many occasions when we think of how that might be, but I'll give you one. The fact is that under the Pauline privilege, if you are married to someone who's not a Christian and they are putting obstacles in the way of your faith, you can get a divorce. In early Christian life, which is generally, I think, the only exception I know to Christ's view on the indissolubility of marriage.
Adultery.
Yes.
One thing that...
Well, no, not adultery. The fact that your spouse is obstructing your practice of the Christian religion.
Christ said, if I'm not mistaken, that adultery is also a reason to get divorced. I got to tell you, one thing that has really struck me in the last 3 or 4 years that I've been living in Europe is how radical Pope Francis is, and many of the bishops are, about opening the borders of Europe to foreigners who tend to be Muslim, who are not particularly friendly to Christianity. And of course, Pope Francis always talks about this in terms of compassion to the stranger, the needy, and all that. And yet it seems clear to me that this is a suicidal policy in terms of preserving what is left of Christian culture in Europe. I'm often reminded of a really negative comment I got from a reader of a former blog I had, a German reader, who said, "I'm not a Christian and I would never be. I hate the Christian church. They're ruining my country by welcoming in all these migrants." And that, I don't know the guy's name. He went under the name German reader. But boy, was he angry at the church. And I thought about him when some Catholic leaders in the U.S. criticized JD Vance for going against the Pope's wishes. I mean, you're a Catholic, Liliana. What do you see, or what do you think when you hear Pope Francis and other bishops being so overwhelmingly pro-migration into Europe?
Well, I disagree with him, clearly. But, life is about disagreement, so I'm not taking it very, let's say, personally. But politics and religion will somehow always mix. So I don't believe that we cannot, let's say, take it into consideration because it's impossible, I believe, not to mix it at certain point because throughout the history, always the societies embedded certain spiritual or moral frameworks into the governance. But with this regards, I would rather try to preserve the tradition and keep what is here in the country. And I believe the statements made by Pope Francis, are of course coming from a good heart and maybe compassion, but I completely disagree with them.
Can I throw in that where Pope Francis has that view, and in Rory Stewart's words, I think they're missing something. Simply to say that the people close to your family and the concentric circles beyond that, your neighborhood and then your community and then your nation and so on, to say that's your priority is not to imply you hate anyone. Mm-hmm. It's simply to say you love everyone, which is Christian, but perhaps some people it's you have more obligation to them, and I think this is sometimes lost. That fine, have compassion for the stranger, but surely not at the expense of the people who you not only love also, but you have an actual pre-existing obligation to.
Mm-hmm. The givenness of the obligation. And we go back to one of the fundamental conservative insights from Edmund Burke. Remind us what he said about the little platoons, John.
Well, I can't remember the exact words, but it's on the lines of the little platoons, our neighborhoods, the associations we join, the voluntary bodies we're working for. They nurture civic virtues.
That's how we learn to love.
That's how we learn to love, and also how we learn to act in society, and how we extend our view of other people's needs from your street to your locality, to the state, and to the country. These things are very important, and they reflect genuine human nature. As regards what the Pope says, the problem is the Pope and the American bishops, they concentrate on the rights of the migrant, which is fair enough. We have obligations, but of course the Catechism, the whole Catholic Catechism, is quite clear. The migrants have obligations, and practicality is a factor in every decision. We can't say anyone can come in, because China might export half its population there, and this is simply not allowed. And the migrant has an obligation to respect the laws and the culture of the country to which he or she comes. These things do not seem to figure much in what the Pope says, but they're in the Catechism.
About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I was living in Texas, in Dallas. I moved there from New York. And of course, migration has always been a very big issue in Texas because it's a border state with Mexico. And I noticed something really interesting about discussion of migration. Proper middle-class, respectable people, even those who voted Republican, always wanted to show their compassion and welcome immigrants and, talk about how we can make this work. But I noticed that they didn't actually have to bear the heavy burden of mass migration. Mm-hmm. They would send their kids to either good public schools in the suburbs or private schools, whereas the children of the working class and the poor, Black, white, and even Latino, native-born Latino, they had to send their kids to schools that were suddenly overwhelmed with children who had a right to an education but couldn't speak a word of English. The same with the public hospitals. In the United States, under that system, if you had health insurance, as you did if you had a good middle-class job, you didn't have to worry about having to go to the public hospitals, unlike the poor. And the public hospitals in Texas then were overwhelmed with illegal migration. And I really became a traitor to my class in that way, because I saw that my fellow middle-class professionals just did not see the working class and the poor. Or if they did, they had this caricature of them as some sort of redneck who just hated brown people. And in fact, many of the people who were resentful of this uncontrolled migration were themselves Black or native-born Latino.
A thought I've had on this more generally over the last few years is that what you're really describing is, on the political left, they've forgotten that a big part of their constituency were not the middle classes, but perhaps the working classes, say in the UK. So Labour represented the working classes. But what we've seen in the UK is what I call the ideological gentrification of the left, where the Labour has been colonised, essentially, by sort of middle class sort of elites, in a sense. And they've brought with them their preoccupations, some of which are their sort of virtue signaling. I mean, I actually think when you talked about the schools sending people to their school, to just a state school instead of a private school, even though they had the option, I don't even think it's necessarily about the ideology. I think it's keeping up with the Joneses. It's so the neighbor doesn't judge you. Because if it becomes the habit in that community to say, we can do without that, we're secure enough that we can send them to a public school and it's to a state school and it's fine. That is it's an expectation of your neighbors or of your community. So it's not really about the ideology so much as what the people around you are doing, and in my view. But I think in general what we're seeing is, there's been a lot of the institutes that represent people have been taken over by middle-class preoccupations, elite cosmopolitan preoccupations.
Educated middle class.
Precisely. And it's what's happened to the Democrats. The Democrats, from a European perspective, completely baffling watching them walk like lemmings off the cliff into this election defeat. I mean, there are so many things they could have done to improve over the years, to improve their ability to compete. And they didn't do it. Why not? Because in the echo chamber they're in, clearly no one is pointing out to them why Trump is so popular among people who 10 years ago had voted, say, for Obama.
Now, I'm going to talk about my favorite political topic since Trump was inaugurated, what's happened to USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. It was founded in the 1960s by President John F. Kennedy to be a philanthropic charity arm of the U.S. government to help build hospitals, vaccinate poor children in the third world, and on and on and on. It has become, actually, in fact, the funding arm for manufacturing consent for globalism, globalist liberalism. Now, this is something that we know a lot about here in Hungary because so much of the opposition to the Orbán government has been funded by USAID. In fact, Samantha Power, the director of USAID under Joe Biden, came here to Budapest in, I think it was 2023, and made a big show of giving $20 million, which can go a long way in a small country like this, to NGOs, pro-democracy NGOs, transparency NGOs, which were all about liberalism. Well, Trump sends Elon Musk and his team into USAID to look at their books. And he lifted up the rock, and all of these nasty bugs scatter everywhere. It turns out the U.S. government has been funding so many NGOs to do things like, and here's some of the examples they pulled up from what they found, $1.5 million to, quote, advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces and business communities. There was $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland. There was $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala, and on and on and on. Trump cut it all off, and it seems like they've cut the head off the Hydra. If I'm not getting that metaphor right, but by cutting off the flow of money, of taxpayer dollars to all these liberal NGOs, he's really scrambling the playing field globally, right? What do you think?
Well, I think one thing is that what do the American people think they're doing when they're attempting to, in a sense, subsidize and use influence to impose the political and moral views of about 10 to 15%, the extreme liberal end of the American population, on countries which have very different cultural opinions and values and views and religious views. This is a cultural imperialism of the worst and most ridiculous kind. After all, the views we're talking about here include such things as gender fluidity, the idea that a man can become a woman simply by declaring that he feels that way. That is not going to fly. It isn't flying, as you see now, in the United States. Why should it fly in Uganda? Or why should it? The answer is it doesn't. American diplomacy is now distorted by the desire to, in a sense, take moral novelties like gender theory and critical race theory, which is racist, anti-racism. It's a fraud, and it's very damaging to multiracial societies because it sows distrust between different communities. And I think we should condemn this, actually. Well, it is being condemned, but the fact is, for the last 4 years, and before that too, it had been gradually adopted as a kind of American foreign policy based on human rights. Not really, based on this extreme gender theory, this extreme racial theory.
Well, so I think it's important to contextualize USAID. I mean, you mentioned how it was a moral project in a sense. It actually wasn't. It was part of a broader thing during the Cold War of when the Cold War started, how could they fight a war without it becoming a hot war in the age of nuclear weapons? And one of the ways to gain influence over the recently decolonized countries, which was most of them, was to have these efforts at international development in order to gain allies, right? And so the Soviets and the West had international development agencies competing for influence over these non-aligned former colonies. So it's really important to understand that the international development as a project was never simply a moral project. Sure. It absolutely was a political project, but it's a political project of the Cold War. And the point I want to make is that the Cold War is long over, but all institutes have an internal logic where they're interested in their own perpetuation and consolidation. All institutes want to continue and gain more power. And this is what we've seen is this metastasization of these programs like USAID, and it's not the only one, nor is it just in the States where this is happening. And it's combined with something else, I think, that we talk a lot, and indeed Trump talks a lot about how in the West we don't build things anymore, we don't make things, we're a service economy. If you've got a culture that no longer makes things with hammers and chisels and machines, but you're just providing services, it's kind of natural that when you think about what do we do abroad, it's no longer building bridges, it's putting together services programs, it's plays, it's a DEI in the workplace.
Well, the women's studies graduates from the liberal arts colleges have to do
exactly.
something.
So precisely that. And that we still have engineers at university, but we have all these other programs of people who perhaps wouldn't have been in university before, now doing all of these degrees in the humanities. And look, I have a background in the humanities, but I'm not sure all degrees are necessarily equal, but you need to create jobs for all these people. And so there's been this entire culture that's emerged around a series of buzzwords, many of which we're familiar with, many of which are DEI associated. And I think that they have actually also been projects which are probably cheaper to do than big infrastructure ones, and lower risk and higher reward where it matters these days, which is PR. And so as a consequence, I have no problem at all with what they're doing to the USAID.
I discovered a few years ago that in 2015, under Obama, USAID partnered with our old friend George Soros and his Open Society Foundation to translate and publish and distribute Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, which is a big 60s era activist manual, because they wanted to overthrow the government, the conservative government of Macedonia. They put that in Macedonia. And that year, there were lots of riots in Macedonia. I think it's just extraordinary that the American people, that their money that they think is going for development and proper things was actually going to overturn governments. Even worse, I think, as a journalist, it turns out that Elon Musk found $478 million that USAID sent to something called the Internews Network. This was one of these transnational NGOs that worked with Davos, World Economic Forum, and others to train journalists, and to train journalists also to fight disinformation, which is to say information that runs counter to Washington's narrative. One of the things they found, too, was this very organization was training journalists and activists in other countries to try to strangle the advertising away from disinformation providers, meaning those information providers, news outlets and so forth, that didn't follow the narrative. I mean, it's all cooked. Come on, John, you've been involved in public broadcasting too. And
yes, I have.
What does this make you think as some voice of America?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was with Radio Free or at Radio Liberty. And I think, by the way, they have done a very, very important job since the Cold War and up to the present. I worked with some of the best people in journalism when I was there, and many of them were, of course, from the countries themselves. Some of them had just escaped by the skin of their teeth with the police driving into the airport and trying to stop the plane leaving to bring, in this case, a very gifted woman journalist to run an Uzbek service. Now, that is important, but of course. It was a job which you had an English language newsroom, and by and large, the English language newsroom, and I think this is true also in Voice of America, tends to be on the radical end of the journalistic spectrum, and they communicate those ideas and those judgments, so that, for example, Hungary ceased to be. They announced that they had to open an office here because why? Well, effectively, they were saying, without saying, that they thought Hungary was no longer a democracy. It plainly is a democracy, and you discover that at every election in which the left thinks it's going to win. At that point, you don't get any criticism of the electoral system at all. But and until now, they haven't succeeded. But by the way, the opposition will win one day, because that always happens. Nobody stays in power forever. And when that happens, I hope they apologize. But as regards Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, they do important work. I wouldn't close them down. I would simply say that you should particularly in the English language broadcast newsroom, I'd get a more balanced journalistic set, a more balanced set of journalists who are less radical and more representative, well, actually, I would say of America than of the journalistic profession.
No, I just wanted to say one thing to what Callum said earlier regarding why these funds were going to those specific NGOs. Why, for example, not to the infrastructure? Well, because it's not your goal to have already, a flourishing country, totally developed with amazing infrastructure. Your goal is rather to have those plans, that will go. And will be following the sun. I would rather see it in this way. It's much easier, and your goal is rather to have this narrow-minded, they wouldn't call themselves narrow-minded, but very open-minded, cosmopolitan citizens of another country that would be going along with what you're saying to them. But the countries that they are choosing, they were also not very, highly developed. They are rather choosing those countries that can be still under their control in a way.
Yeah, well, they're not doing DEI programs in Saudi Arabia now, are they? A few years ago, I was talking to some Catholic legislators from Uganda, 3 women parliamentarians. They were here at a meeting in Europe, and they told me they were so angry at the US and Western Europe for the way we handled aid money to them. They said, China is really running circles around you all, because every American government aid agency or Western European agency wants to know, what are you going to do for LGBT as a condition of getting aid? China doesn't ask that. Now, China's not doing this because they're naturally charitable. There will be a price to pay for aid. But the Africans were saying that the Chinese at least didn't demand that they cease to be African and have their own African views. But this was a sort of cultural imperialism that was coming from the US and Western Europe. That insanity seems to be over now with Trump.
It seems to be, and of course it also exists within Europe too, with the European Commission attempting to change family policy and gender policy in countries in this part of the world that don't agree with the latest progressive fads. It's very important, in my view, that we strike a good balance here. I think in the Cold War we did, and in relations with Middle Eastern countries, our pressure to stop torture, to prevent what's going on, for example, in Iran, those where women are brutally treated and furthermore executed for not wearing the hijab. That is completely legitimate. That seems to me. But we cannot expect to go into other countries and tell them how to completely reorder their views on sexuality, on religion, on belief in God, on abortion, and all of these things. And we have become too arrogant in that. There is in politics a time for persuasion, a need for that, and a time for laws. We can't, when we're dealing with other countries, we have to rely much more on persuasion than on bullying, and we have forgotten that.
This is how the left has behaved even in the United States, for example. Joe Biden deciding unilaterally to say that by government policy, biological males who identify as transgender must be allowed to compete against females. He just decided it because liberals, I'm generalizing, but I think it is generally true, the liberals in charge, they think that they're morally right. And not only are their opponents morally wrong, their opponents are evil. So I think this is one reason why it's going to be very hard for the left in the United States to come back from what Trump is doing, because if you try to get them to compromise in a sensible way, how are you going to compromise with evil, with what they believe is evil?
Yeah, that's right.
No, they're blind to the other rights, to the conservative ones, because they somehow, I would say, they not prioritize. I wouldn't say they like completely reject the values of the right side, but they somehow cannot understand them. Like it's not going through their minds, which is quite surprising. Because on the other hand, the other side, I would say, is quite open for discussion, for open discussion. But there's nobody whom they can talk to because they don't want to.
There's actually been research on this, social science research, showing that people on the right are far better at understanding people on the left and their arguments. They just disagree, but the opposite is not true.
Well, we're seeing abortion and euthanasia as emerging as very serious issues, both in domestic politics in Europe. And Britain, for example, there's a euthanasia bill going through the House of Commons at the moment, but also involved in foreign policy. And Latin America, it comes under tremendous pressure from the United States and from the European Union to abandon the Catholic beliefs of the majority of its citizens. Now, there are disputes in all of these countries, of course, on these issues, but they have to be, it seems to me, settled in those countries. Any new balance between liberalism on the one hand and traditional values on the other should be set in the country and not as a result of, Uncle Sam turning up carrying a big stick.
It's the ordo amoris, right?
Yes.
And that brings us to another big topic about real existing post-liberalism. One of the things that I think is a tremendous historical story of our era is how the abandonment of Christianity within the West as the controlling narrative in the West that tells us who we are and what we are to do, how that is leading us to these incommensurable political ideas. And what I mean practically is this. Even in your youth, John, and in my youth, however attenuated, the West was still a Christian society. Even if you never went to church, the Bible and biblical values were still defined the frame of political debate. Well, that began to change after the 1960s. And so what we have now, and the philosopher Alistair McIntyre recognized this as far back as the 1980s, is that when people don't have a commonly shared source of transcendent values within which to ground their politics and their lawmaking and to set the bounds for the debate, then it becomes nonsense. It becomes a matter of clashing emotions and will to power. That being the case, it seems that liberalism, classical liberalism, which is built on Christian values, it's a secularization of Christian values, as the historian Tom Holland has pointed out. How do we stay liberal in the absence of this shared religion? And does that mean that we are now post-liberal?
Well, I mean, one thing I'd say first is that, people always think about the teenage rebel, and it's quite difficult to be a rebel these days because there's nothing to rebel against. So there is no authority. The parents, the ones saying, be different. But it seems to be, it's an interesting era we're in right now because people are saying we're in this post-liberal era now. And what does that mean? There seem to be two candidates right now coming out of the States. One is what's represented loosely by JD Vance, this idea that everything went wrong with the Protestants. Let's go back to sort of a Catholic understanding of Christian values pre-Reformation. And
I don't think that's his view, but
no, but not his view. But that's kind of the idea that a more sort of Christian-founded view. And then you've got the I'm simplifying a little bit, but the other is the more sort of Silicon Valley Peter Thiel approach, which is that it's not that we need to get rid of it, go back to before the Reformations, but rather we need to go back before Christianity entirely. Christian values, in a sense, are the problem. That seems to be the two options being given. And but I think while this debate is going on, is what is conservatism now, or what is the way forward after the liberal era. The worry I have right now is that actually when we're entering an era of just extreme version of what we had in the last 30 years. I mean, I like what Trump's doing. There's one thing I don't like, which is what Musk is doing, because what Musk is doing just looks like a hyper neoliberal takeover.
What do you mean? What is Musk doing?
This idea of just treating the government like a business, like directly like a business, of him coming in and taking the model for what he did to Twitter as a private business and doing it to the state with all those complex systems. I'm a bit worried about that only because it feels to me to be precisely the sort of thing you'd do if there was like a hostile takeover of something in a corporate way. So it seems to me less post-liberal, more hyper-neoliberal, that element of it at least.
Well, I think we come here up against a real problem. When the US in the Second World War was sending its troops to countries like Iran, as a matter of fact, it actually sent them instructions. And one of them was, look, you'll see a lot of things in this country that strike you as wrong. And remember, it's not your country, it's theirs. So you must accept that that's their way of life. And now, that in the case of Iran, of course, it struck people as theocratic or backward. In Britain, of course, the American army in the Second World War found itself in the embarrassing position of trying to keep a segregated army segregated when the British, including both the officials, the government, and the and ordinary people, said, "Well, we don't have a colour bar here in England, racial segregation at all," and so. So there's a film the U.S. Army made in which shows an elderly lady saying goodbye to an American soldier who's been billeted with her and giving him a little kiss and saying, and he's very, thank you so much, you were such a kind hostess and so on. And then the man says, that may shock you.
Oh, it was a black soldier.
That's right. You see. And now, what does this mean? It means that live and let live. That's the liberalism which we have to have if we're going to have multicultural societies. But even then, there are limits to that. We cannot accept certain things, like, well, the famous example being sati in India, but we can't accept, for example,
burning widows of
yes, or in England today, the ordinary British population does not like the idea that girls are not going to get an education in science and mathematics if they're Muslim. Some Muslim parents want to do that. And we find ourselves in a difficult situation. There's no easy answer to it, but it has to be, any compromise has to be firmly in the live and let live direction.
Well, we find ourselves here in Hungary, which has been condemned for a long time by the great and the good in Washington and Brussels as an illiberal democracy. Now, this was a phrase coined by Prime Minister Orbán himself, saying he wanted to build an illiberal democracy here. It was an unfortunate phrase, I think, because what he was trying to say, I believe, was he wanted to build a Christian democracy here in the sense that the country's laws and understanding of itself are based on the Christian faith. He himself is Reformed, Christian Reformed, which is a minority faith here in Hungary. Most of the country that's religious is Catholic. Nevertheless, he's been quite clear that Hungary's understanding of itself is Christian, and that conflicts with the understanding of liberalism that is au courant now in Washington and Brussels. So this means, in effect, that they don't have gay marriage here in Hungary. The Orbán government a few years ago passed a law forbidding the spreading of what they called LGBT propaganda to minors. It caused a huge row. Mark Rutte, then the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, said that Hungary ought to be thrown out of the EU because it wouldn't let transgender comics go to its children. Very strange. But I think that Orbán is setting actually a good example of what democracy, what liberal democracy should look like in the new era.
I completely agree. Plus, on the one hand, we're all united in diversity in the European Union with its beautiful motto. But then when somebody else, let's say, is setting different policies that are not going along with the mainstream in Brussels, they are being punished very, very openly. And all of those punishments and fines are rather political. And that's obvious and that's visible. And Poland is the best example of it. But just, thinking about actually liberal democracies and secularism that is so present there, secularism actually plays a role as a quasi-religion. If we look at the environmentalism, for example, progressive activism, they also have their own religions. They just work on different rules and different. They have different values. But it's impossible actually not to have values. It's impossible because people cannot live as a society without them. So, they have their own quasi-religion, so it's not, I would say, as simple as it could be.
Can I just add to that I think you're absolutely right. I think it was Max Weber wrote that the greatest legacy of Protestantism was secularism, which kind of gets to my point about going back pre-Protestant. But and if you look at the social justice movements and the climate movements, what they are actually are classic Protestant millenarian movements. They're classic millenarian movements in the sense of saying, the world is in sin, we must confront it and establish utopia. The climate movement's 100% like that. The social justice one is too.
Wokeness, that's what it is.
Yeah, it's a millenarian cult in a sense. Yeah. And so I'd 100% agree with you on that, I think.
But then there's a problem. I mean, I agree with what you've just said, and what you both said. But nonetheless, you're going to have, whether they are orthodox, whether they are religions we know about, obviously Islam, Judaism, and so on, or whether they are kind of faux religions, like as you described, we still have to find ways of living with each other in society. Now, here's a good thing about liberalism. Surely Robin Letwin pointed out once the distinction between a liberal and an illiberal society is that in a liberal society, we don't object to communes being set up which are run against the general opinions of the society, as far as possible. And indeed, the history of America is a history often of these communes. And now, to be a capitalist under communism and a liberal society, it might mean you manufactured pencils, you could get executed. That plainly means that our kind of society, open, liberal, and whatever, is superior. However, that society still has got to come into terms with the reality that some things that individuals and groups want to do are outrageous to others, and there will have to be some kind of negotiated solution to that, negotiated through democratic politics or through international law. It's a really big problem. I don't make light of it, but on the other hand, in the end, the traditions of the societies in Europe, which are progressive and intelligent and well-run societies by world standards, they're the ones that are going to have to prevail in the end.
One of the biggest political lessons I learned when I first came to Hungary is what Viktor Orban saw, that what passes for liberalism in the West, it's not liberal at all. It is illiberal progressivism. But because it is so widely shared in the media and academia, in the opinion-forming classes, they don't see it. I think they generally don't see it. They think this is just normal, right? But from Orban's point of view, and I think he was completely correct on this, and I think most conservatives, at least in the US, UK, and others, see this also. They're tired of the fraudulence of the left, those in control of institutions, claiming to be liberal when they're anything but. The question is this: is it possible or how possible is it, or desirable is it, to have anything neutral? Is there any such thing as neutral liberalism?
Well, I think there is, but I think it has limits, as I've just tried to argue. that there are some things that you might find so outrageous that you would say, well, I understand you, that's your tradition, old boy, but we cannot have that in this country. Now, I think those things are few in number, but of course, the more multicultural a society is, the more groups there are in that society with their own distinctive moralities, the more we're going to get clashes of that kind, which is probably why multicultural societies generally don't work and lead to conflict. We now have them, so we have to live with that conflict, but we have to handle it very carefully.
I think there's an important point I think people don't really make often enough, which is liberalism exists to accommodate the plurality of our natural societies, regardless of just before there's immigration. Because between us, on this table here, we have a plurality of perspectives. And frankly, I disagree with myself half the time, so I'm plural in myself. So liberalism exists to accommodate the natural plurality, the natural diversity of things. But the weird thing is people are now saying, let's throw as much diversity as possible to test the limits of liberalism. That was never the point. The point was never to say, test liberalism to its limits. Is liberalism was saying, there is already diversity. Let's have a system that manages us to coexist without fighting. The point was never to say, load it, to stress it to failure. That was never the purpose. And what we're seeing now in society is people taking liberalism as something to prove a point, like the purity of the concept. Let's test it to failure. And that is absolutely not the point of what it was supposed to be.
And also you will find that your illiberal progressive, as you say, the dominant ideology, dominant religion in the media, cultural, administrative classes in the West, that's insincere. It is very keen to crush any resistance from traditions of its own society, but it has an almost limitless appetite for outrage when it comes from new groups in the society which are, hostile or difficult to assimilate.
Isn't it bizarre that among the left in the US especially, and probably also in Europe, that Gaza, which is perhaps the most backwards, theocratic, homophobic, sexist, you name it, society on earth, became the darling of the left? I mean, it's just bonkers. And I think it's because they were the other, you know? Yeah. And it's something that they could be, that the left could use as a hammer to crack the heads of its domestic opponents.
And where does Rory Stewart stand on that?
On Gaza?
On the question of how to handle these conflicts.
I'm not too sure, honestly. I think in general, I think his concern, or it used to be 10, 15 years ago, he was warning against the overreach of big technocracies. Isaiah Berlin was a famous political philosopher, Latvian, but Oxford-based. And he wrote this great essay called The Pursuit of the Ideal. And he said all of Western society seems to be built around this pursuit of a Platonic ideal, the idea that, and there's three hubrises in it, or three assumptions, that answers exist, that we can find them, and then we can act upon them for the greater good. And that type of thinking, and he goes on in his essay to dismantle this idea, to say the answers probably don't exist. It's hubristic to think they do. It's more hubristic to think we can find them. And it's even more hubristic to think we can act upon them for the greater good. Stewart's view used to be about humility. Rory Stewart was a big one for quoting T.S. Eliot, saying, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. But I find he's shifted now in how he views many things, to have positions that I think 10, 15 years ago he would have seen as hubristic. So he's quite an advocate now of big technocratic overreach in the context of things like climate change and so on.
Well, we are about to go through the annual Munich, Munich Defense Security Summit. I remember being there last year. This is where all, for our listeners, this is where all the defense ministers and people in national security from the Western countries get together to talk through issues. I was there a year ago at the invitation of JD Vance, who's, as I've said, he's an old friend, and he invited me to come over to have dinner because he was a new senator He had staked out a position as being against American policy on Ukraine. He wanted to bring the war to an end, and nobody there would talk to him. It wasn't just that they would disagreed with him, they froze him out. So he said, I'd rather have dinner with a friend than go sit there and be ignored by these people. Well, now he's about to return as the sitting vice president of the United States. I would give anything to be a fly on the wall in those meetings.
Well, I agree, but isn't the problem here that now politics is such a difficult topic for people that they no longer treat others as human beings, potential friends, spouses, so on, but as walking sandwich board men for a particular ideology. And I think that we've got to get over that. We are, and I agree with the points that I think you both made, that we have to get away from a society in which we run into human beings so infrequently. We have to get back to one in which, years ago, Florence King, the American anti-feminist author, said, the reason for feminism is that in the old days, a housewife met a whole series of people during the day. The knife grinder came by. A series of tradesmen would come to the house. You met someone, you offered them tea, and now you're walled away in a home which very few people come to visit. You speak on the phone. If you go to a store, you're addressing a machine that will take your credit card. I think this has got to change because we're ceasing to be human beings.
Well, let's go to our final topic today, fantasy politics. Trump 2.0 has been a fantasy presidency so far, for at least for conservatives. A laundry list of great things are happening. But if each of you could suggest just one policy for America or for your own country that would unlock everything, what would it be? It's a hard question, isn't it?
Well, it can be crazy.
Of
All right,
course.
let's go. Well, maybe, I don't know, for the US, maybe President Trump could propose such policy that would require very close cooperation between NASA and SpaceX, and he will give them 10 years to colonize Mars, for example.
Well, I'm still waiting I'm Canadian with my passport, so I'm looking forward to my American passport.
Oh, well, no, we don't want you all in because then we'll have so many liberal senators added.
No, that's true. Well, actually, not necessarily more the way Canada's going now. So,
But you will have public healthcare system,
yeah, and you got to put those Mars rocket launchers somewhere, and Canada's a pretty good place.
Well, I'd like to outlaw fantasy politics. It seems to me that on everything from net zero to American foreign policy, we're governed by people who live fantasy political lives. And I think we want to have solid, practical people who deal with problems as they arise. Try to come up with workable solutions, try to persuade others, but don't have dreams which they wish to impose on the rest of us. I have my own dreams, of course. I dare say if I impose them on you, all of you, you'd be, you wouldn't be happy about that. But that's what politicians increasingly want to do. So an end to fantasy, back to bricks and mortar improvements.
That's the craziest, I think.
That is crazy. I have one thing. I think that one of the danger signs for our civilization is the collapse of the humanities, study of the humanities. Now, it's collapsing for a couple of reasons, in my view. One is the ideology of the left. They've completely hollowed out the study of philosophy, literature, and so forth. We all know that story. But there's also pressure from the right. A lot of people on the right, especially in the U.S. at least, very practical businessmen. No, that stuff does not really matter. I think President Trump, I wish he could get together with whoever the contemporary version of Bill Bennett is. Remember Bill Bennett from the Reagan years? He was pushed classical learning. I think that perhaps President Trump could get together with people like Pano Canelos at the University of Austin and other leaders who are traditionalists but innovative people like Roger Kimball, your friend in New York, and try to figure out a way that the government could incentivize and fund traditional learning, not political learning, but take lessons from the classical Christian and the classical schooling movement that is now becoming much more popular among little kids and high schoolers, and go back and study the Greeks and the Romans and the great text of Western civilization, not with an eye to finding out how evil we were, but in a truthful way to really understand how these texts made us and how they could make us. There was an essay recently in The Point magazine by a woman named Mana Asfari, an Iranian immigrant, who talked about how in her education in the U.S. and at University of Southern California, I think, she learned nothing about the great books, nothing. She learned lots about the politics of the professors. And then she went to Cambridge and studied under James Orr at St. John's College. James is a friend of ours, and he's a serious conservative and a very broad-minded conservative in the best sense. And Mana wrote that that's how she learned how to love the great books and what they actually meant to her. I think that's fantastic. And I think there's got to be something the U.S. government can do to promote and advance knowledge and awareness of this without simply just cutting it because the libs have taken it over.
Don't you think the ordinary American public is doing voluntarily what you want? I mean, I think other countries to a lesser extent, but in America, look at all the history books that get sold. And the Richard Brookhiser is just one of a number of historians of the American founding and of the political leaders who emerged at that time. And his books sell, and so do the books of, I'm trying to think of the others now, Forrest MacDonald some years ago, all of these people. And I think that's because people arrive at a certain point in life and they say, hey, I never got any good history teaching in school. And they go out and buy these books.
Right, but I think there has to be more systematic, and there has to be more money into it, because a lot of these things that are important to the survival of our civilization can't survive on the marketplace alone. Like, I never go to the opera, although I'm going this Friday for my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. I'm going to the opera, and I think the opera, I know it is an important part of Western civilization and our culture, and I want it to be there. And if that requires public subsidy for it, then I support that sort of thing. But I think that we just can't throw money at anything that claims to be worthy.
Well, we already had such programs, just sending the money. So
this is true.
We don't want to repeat
transgender operas. But yeah, I think that we are at a real crossroads now, and I don't expect that the Trump administration will do that, but boy, would it be great if he did, and got people like this poet, James Matthew Wilson, a youngish poet in America who's a real traditionalist, a real scholar with a real passion for the beauty of words. Put men and women like that in positions of power to use government money, not to impose a right-wing view, but just to teach the basics that have been completely neglected, either by commission or omission. Yeah. That's my fantasy.
I totally agree. The change should be done rather from the wisdom, not the revenge, I believe. So that's the future. Yeah.
Well, it's been a big, long discussion today. Thank you all so much. John, Liliana, Callum, thanks for being here and for your insights. And thank you very much for joining us at View from the Danube. We'll see you next month.